Okay, thanks. Nice to see you. A couple of announcements. I've tried again today to make sure Perusall lets you see your score as you're going, but only got it done this afternoon. Has anyone been on since and you're getting immediate feedback? Excellent. Okay, so that's taken care of. Number two, I forgot to tell you an important thing about the D2L, about the quizzes, the exams, the midterms. The D2L lists when they become available to you. You're going to do them on D2L. And in each case, I've made that over a weekend. So for most of the midterms, you can start anytime Friday, if you're one of those people that wants your Saturday and Sunday totally free. Uh, on the weekend before the break, the October break, I make it available 6 in the morning. So if you really want to get it done. And you have to have it completed before midnight on Sunday night. You decide when to have it. Whenever you start, however, there is a time limit, right? Once you start, you have 90 minutes to complete it. And um, yeah, whenever that is. Questions about that? I haven't done that in this class before, but I did it last fall for neural development, and I was pretty happy with it. Frankly, one of the things that does for me is it gives me 3 more class periods to talk and let you talk. So that's that's what I like about it. Um, and I'll say this explicitly, even though you're doing this on your own, even though you're doing this on your own time over that weekend, you're not to collaborate with other people. You're not to use AI to help you answer the questions. And it's an open book in the sense that, you can go to your book to look for things, but really with 100 questions in 90 minutes, if you have to look up every answer, you're in trouble, right? You're not going to do that. So um, questions about that format. We'll see how it works. Okay, the time has come. Who's got the joke? Who's ready? I can call on you at random. You were supposed to look up a sex joke that has no shock words in it. Come on, not that hard. No one's going to volunteer. I mean, Hannah's, is what her grandfather told. And here's the thing about that joke, Hannah. Number one, why does it have to be a parrot? And why does he have to talk like a pirate? I mean, it's just, there are all those red herrings in that joke that, your grandfather probably did that just to mess with you. Okay, you got a joke? Okay, hold on.
What does a hot dog use for protection?
I don't know. What does a hot dog use for protection?
Condiments.
Okay, I can't complain, right? That's good. It brings a moan. Um, and now the word nerd in me wonders. So, condiment and condom, do they have a similar root? And I'll look that up later. Any questions about what we talked about last time? How far we got? We just started chapter 1, and we're certainly going to finish it today. Nope. Okay. So, as the chapter points out, there are and as we talked about how important culture is for deciding what is and isn't okay, um, it, you know, uh, in every culture, no one has ever found any culture where there aren't do's and don'ts about sexuality, right? It may have existed for a while. Margaret Mead seemed to describe Samoa as being a place that's like that, but that was too rosy a view. In every culture, there are always some sex acts that are taboo, or some relationships that are taboo, but it varies remarkably in terms of, you know, um, in terms of, what in different cultures. So, this wasn't there last time, and so I don't know how to get rid of it. Anyone else know? If I exit full screen mode, and through Zoom, yep, yes. Okay, it's an empirical question. Okay, now I got to get rid of this again. Okay, you're right. So, Ian, that's that's not logical. You understand that? How did you know? Well, no, no. Thank you. Okay. So, all right, it's now established. Ian knows more than I do. Who's shot? Um, and among, I mean, and it's hard to find any sex act that's totally taboo in every culture that people have found. Most cultures have at least some sort of taboo about marrying or having sex with relatives, especially close relatives like parent child, brother sister. But there have been exceptions to that too, right? The ancient Egyptians, in order to stay in power, the pharaohs decided, well, we don't want to share with another family, so we'll just have brothers and sisters mate each other. And that way, by golly, we know who's in power, right? It's definitely our crew. There, but I'd say that's probably an exception. But other things like sodomy, which is when something is put into somebody's anus, right? Either a dildo or a phallus. Sodomy is illegal in some societies and totally accepted in others. Ancient Rome, ancient Greece, there were no prohibitions against sodomy between men, for example. Likewise, pornography, some of the oldest artifacts we have of human beings, I don't know that I included a copy, but you've seen them, are these stone carvings that people have found in archaeological sites across Western Europe that are clearly a woman with breasts, right? So, they're described as fetishes or fertility goddesses, things like that, all sort of euphemisms. Psst, men were using those to masturbate. That was the pornography of that age. And it's kind of funny that in so many cultures, pornography is totally put down, and here the archaeologists are just so excited when they find some, right? Imagine what future societies will be thinking of. Likewise, prostitution. It's not always illegal, not in every society. In some society, it's well regulated. Things may be about to change in the United States. I don't know. If so, it's going to be jurisdiction by jurisdiction. Some jurisdictions like Nevada, with licensing, prostitution is not illegal, and um, and there's a growing sentiment among sex workers, which is these days considered a more polite term than prostitute. A growing feeling among sex workers that they should be recognized for what they are and what they do, and should have rights like everyone else, and you know that why shouldn't, if everything else gets sold, why shouldn't access to sex? And I don't know the answer to that, obviously. There's also, with lots of different taboos, some cultures, not in others, about contraception. Contraception's been around a long time. So there was a time when, before technology was available, it seems pretty clear that for the man to remove his penis just before he ejaculate, that was a time-honored method of trying to avoid pregnancy. It's terribly unreliable, by the way, and it provides no assurance to the woman, right? How does she know he's going to pull out in time, for example? Which matters, as we'll see when we talk about in the appendix. It matters because in general, in most societies, if a pregnancy happens, almost all the burden is put on the woman, not on the father, right? And so, but once technology became available, I forget whether it's Casanova or Don Juan. One of those folks talks about having come up with a lemon peel a lemon and use that rind to, encourage his mistresses to put that over her cervix to avoid pregnancy. Or eventually people started making condoms. That was way back in the 1700s and 1800s. They weren't very good. They tended to be made out of lamb skin and things like that, or lamb's intestine, things like that, and were considered reusable. But people have always been trying to get rid of, or rather, stop pregnancies. In terms of getting rid of pregnancies, there's also wide variation across cultures about what is and isn't acceptable. In in those ancient cultures that are so well documented, if you had a baby and you didn't want it, or if you weren't happy with the sex of it, it was perfectly acceptable to take it out in the woods and leave it, right? That'd take care of itself. And yeah, questions about that? And people have often sought things a woman could ingest to get rid of a pregnancy. And people have tried fairly desperate things like overactivity and stuff like that. And eventually people found, mixtures of herbs that would likely cause an abortion, and they were very risky, et cetera. Anyway, and in our society, up until the 1970s, abortion was illegal in the United States. And then Roe v. Wade overthrew that. And as many of you know, the Supreme Court lately overthrew Roe v. Wade. And so that's another situation where it's state by state. And we'll talk about that later. In general, teaching people how to avoid pregnancy has in the United States, at least in most Western cultures, it was totally illegal to share that knowledge with people. If you counseled women, for example, that if they could have sex when they're having their period, they almost certainly wouldn't get pregnant. And if they had sex in pretty much in the middle mark, in between two periods, that was a prime time to get pregnant. If you told someone that, you could be arrested and put in jail. If you sent that message, if you sent a letter explaining that to people through the United States Post Office, you're in violation of the Comstock Act and you could be arrested and put in jail. That was illegal. And several women, primarily in American history, have I don't want that. Anyway, have risked brush-ins with the law in order to tell women how to avoid being pregnant. And Margaret Sanger is maybe the one that's most well known, who was a nurse. She had spent time in England, and she comes to New York City, where there's lots of immigrant housing, very dense tenement housing, people that are totally dirt poor, who are doing whatever they can just to survive. And she tells the story of visiting a woman who has a baby and nearly bleeds to death. And she cautions the woman, you have to avoid having another child. And the woman says, our life is so hard. And when my husband comes to me, how can I turn him away? And later, of course, she gets pregnant again and she dies. So that caused her to go on a campaign to try to make it at least legal to give him the most elementary cautions about how to avoid pregnancy. It's a risky business. And one evidence of how important contraception is, you can see here, this is keeping track of the number of births per woman. And in the 1800s and the 1850s, and you notice there's a steady decline. As information about how to avoid getting pregnant spreads, people get pregnant less often. And it's almost always women who take the precaution of not getting pregnant as often. So notice that in 1940, there was a big spike up in the United States in birth rates. How come? What happened? Pardon? They came home. World War II was over, and those men came home, and it was a time of optimism in the United States, and you should have babies. Everyone should have babies. And then something happens in 1960 that the rate goes down again. What was that? Condoms have been around a long time already. Pardon? The Cold War? No, the Cold War got started in the 50s. Think of it, Sputnik, right? Actually got started in the 40s, but nope. Yeah. The pill first became available for sale in the United States in 1960, and its effect was immediate. You have no idea how much it changed the world. Mind you, condoms were already available, but as we'll see, there's lots of things that are less desirable about condoms. But most importantly, the pill is one in which the woman is totally in control. She gets to decide whether she's taking it, and she doesn't have to tell anybody whether she's taking it or not, and she doesn't have to rely on her partner being necessarily truthful about what he's up to. Here's another chart. I didn't get it into your PDF because it just came out. But you can see the same sort of thing. Here's the average number of children that women had, right, starting in the 1950s. So this is at the end of that decline. This decline was due to information, knowledge. But you can see across various continents, the birth rate is going down. We'll talk later about how, in fact, the population of the Earth about 2050 or so, just as population has gone up steeply, about 2050 or so, it's going to go down steeply. And there's going to be a lot less people 200 years from now than there are today. And there's some people that are very alarmed about that. And there's some governments that are alarmed about that. So in China right now, they're worried about the fact that there's fewer and fewer people to take care of all those old people. And they've got more old people than ever because medicine's gotten that much better. And so after years of making it illegal for a woman to have more than one child, China's now trying to encourage women to have more babies. And in our system, they tend to be conservative forces that are trying to encourage women to have more children. I can tell you what's happening in China is none of it's working. Everything they try, it isn't budging the population rate. You know, teaching women how not to have a baby, you're never going to get that genie back in the bottle, right? It's here to stay. I mean, if they have to share the information illegally, the drugs, etc., they will. In the United States, people are trying to come up with laws, incentives to make women be more open to having babies, things like tax breaks and credits, et cetera. But nobody wants to offer the one incentive, and none of those are working, right? It's clear. What's the one incentive they could offer women so that they'd be more likely to have more children? Yeah. Childcare, that's the rub. It's hard for women to think about having to about working. They want to work, they love their careers, but the amount of money they make doesn't quite cover the childcare. So it can be a losing proposition. What's interesting about that way of thinking is this is even true of women who have a partner. How come the childcare isn't coming out of his income in their mind, right? I mean, yeah. Someone else raised a hand. It Yeah, I mean, and people are talking about those ideas, paying people, you know, $1,000 a month until the kid's 18 or something, per kid. Ramika? Right. Yep. Yep. So big differences in paternal. So just across the border, you go north from here that way a little bit. People there, if a woman gets pregnant, she is guaranteed by law that she'll get a year's pay, fully paid, after the baby comes. And in some places, fathers also get paid more. Right. Yeah. And anyone want to bet the chances of any of these things happening in this country? Those same forces who are trying to urge women to have more children, they're never going to go for that. Okay. And in terms of who should be allowed to marry, there's a story I want to tell you about this. As you know, not too long ago, laws in the United States changed so that women could, where same-sex couples could marry. I'm going to take you here. So in 2015, and one of the Supreme Court justices who dissented, who's still in the Supreme Court, and has started talking openly about this decision needs to be overturned to keep same-sex couples from being legally married. That's Justice Thomas, Clarence Thomas, who happens to be, as far as I know, happily married to a woman of a different race. I'm telling you this because I remember, I was young, but I remember in 1967 when those pesky liberal Supreme Court justices told the state of Virginia, you can't keep people from marrying just because they're of two different sexes. And you cannot imagine the outrage at the time, especially in places like Virginia. Yeah, pardon? I'm saying in the state of Virginia, a black man, a white woman, no, it happened to be a white man and a black woman could not legally marry. And that was not the only state that happened. It was the case of the Lovings that came to the Supreme Court. And so first they told the state of Virginia, but the other states had to comply eventually. There was so much outrage. Those activist judges overturning the will of the people because there were all these laws have been passed by the people, states' rights. What on earth gives those so horrible people the right to tell us that we can let black and white people marry? Okay, it was amazing. Who's saying that now? Nobody. There might be people still thinking that way, but they know better than to open their traps, right? Because nobody's got any patience with that. I just want to assure you, whatever, I mean, I can't say that it won't become illegal for same-sex couples to marry in the United States again, but if it happens, it'll be short-lived. That's another genie that's never going back in the bottle. So don't lose heart. Another controversial figure in terms of sex and sex education is Alfred Kinsey, who was working at the University of Indiana in Bloomington as a biologist. And there's a pretty good biopic about his life, and I can't vouch that it's all true, but the major outlines are true, which is he got married and he and his wife were having difficulty having sex. And they consulted a physician who seemed to be about as helpless as they were. And he was a biology professor at Indiana U. He taught, his passion were insects, especially wasps. And so he was a tireless collector of wasp specimens. Apparently he collected over 1 million wasp specimens, et cetera, in his lifetime. And he's teaching biology, and the college students are coming to him with the most basic questions about sex. And so he did something, he changed his field somewhat. He decided, well, somebody should gather information about this. And so he basically, he then started asking people, what kind of sex acts do you do and who do you do them with? And he realized that this was these were tricky questions, and some people might tell him about sex acts that were illegal. And so he came up with an extensive interview survey and trained people to ask people face to face, you're across the table from me, we're here, about the sex acts they participated in. And the folks were trained not to show any emotion or show any approval or disapproval, just the facts, ma'am, and went down the list. How many partners have you had, right? When did you first have sex? Stuff like that. And he reported the results first in a book about the sexual behavior of males in 1948, and later about women. And America was shocked. First of all, that a scientist had actually asked about something so private and that, for most people's mind had nothing to do with science. And number two, at the things he learned. So in his surveys, about 10% of people preferred to have sex with a same-sex partner. In his surveys, it turned out virtually all men masturbated, right? Virtually all of them. And you have to wonder the few that said they didn't, if that's the joke. 97% of men masturbate and 3% of men lie. Right? And that people were having sex outside of marriage, and that many people had more than one partner, even before they got married. This was shocking, and there was, and the United States politically really hasn't gotten over it. In 1953, he published the survey results of women. Pick one up sometime. It is full of graphs and tables. It's the most boring thing you can imagine to read. He and his team did nothing to make it titillating or at all provocative, but it was just the facts. And lots of people didn't accept it. Yeah. In the library? Yeah. Yeah. Oh, yeah. There'll be several copies of each. I mean, I have, but yeah. He absolutely created the Kinsey. Well, I mean, he and his group created the Kinsey scale. How attracted are you to same sex and opposite sex individuals? Yeah, the Kinsey scale. That's who he's named after, who it's named after. And he has been the target of vilification from the day the first book came out. You can hear and read on the internet all sorts of rumors about him, the things he did, most of which are lies. But what he did do, what he did, he came to it as a biologist, not a religious figure. He came to it with just wanting to know what people do. And it's pretty clear that he and his wife tried to be open to trying things that, maybe weren't mainstream, but trying to understand this. But he kept all of that out of his studies. Oh, and here I love this picture. Here he is at the University of California coming to talk, and people were eager to hear what is this stuff he's learning about. But Kinsey, I mean, he only asked people what they did. He didn't try to use any other scientific methods to see what was going on during that. It would be a pair of physicians at Washington University in St. Louis, Masters and Johnson, who would bring people into the lab starting in the 50s and strap onto them physiological measures like heart rate, respiration, stuff like that. And they would actually, have people come in the lab and have sex while they're standing around watching, I guess, and ask people questions afterwards, et cetera. And that too was seen as totally scandalous. By then, they were somewhat more accepted than Kinsey, and they haven't been as vilified as others. It might help that Masters was a physician, but I think really the world had changed by then. And this series apparently is on Amazon, Masters of Sex. It's pretty good. It's about taken from a book of the same name. And today we're caught up in gender wars. So there's what I'm going to say is controversial, but in this class, I will regard sex as a biological construct and gender as a social construct. And I feel like I have to do that because there's so much about sex when we talk about how the two sexes come to have different bodies. There's so much that's different in males versus females, even though the overall process is, of course, the same in all humans. Um, and um, and that gender is a social construct. It refers to the traits that differ on average between men and women, or girls and boys, or that which can vary from one culture to another. One thing you don't know is that you've all heard about how sex chromosomes are important in sex differentiation. We'll talk about that in some detail. In fact, the person who first discovered that chromosomes decide whether an individual is going to be male or female was this woman, Nettie Stevens, that you've never heard of, who was working with mealworms, I think, at the time. And she realized that females have two chromosomes that are alike. They just worked out in these bugs how to see the chromosomes with a microscope at the time. And she noticed that females had two long versions of a particular chromosome, and the males had one long one and one short one. And she designated them long and short. But later people would find the same thing in fruit flies, and they gave it the designation X and Y that you're used to hearing from now on. Now, evolutionarily, it turns out that sex determination method in flies has nothing to do with sex determination in people. But when they found a similar situation in people, they adopted the name that the fruit fly people were using and called them X and Y. And it's really important to know that ideas about gender have changed over time. right? Think about within our own culture, right? How much things have changed in terms of what men and women are expected to do. And we'll talk about this in more detail later. Oh, and then there's the I mostly like this because it shows Sparty there with the um another thing that's changed a lot over time are ideas about what's attractive in women. Those uh, those prehistoric sculptures I told you about that display women, all the women figures in those things, they're round. They have big hips, big waists, big breasts. And because that was, for Neanderthal man, that was the most attractive woman you could imagine. Because in those days, if you saw a woman that looked like this, she was going to die soon. Even into Renaissance Europe. This was Rubens' idea of the most ideal woman, happened to be his mistress, but that she would look like this. Again, because in his time too, if you looked like this, you were going to die. And it was not seen as attractive. And so we'll talk about how, things change, ideas change. We can't talk about this without talking about the Kama Sutra, which is a collection of writings, all fairly ancient. There were, in fact, several different authors, clearly. And this is a modern depiction of some of the drawings that were, associated with that. Everyone thinks about the Kama Sutra as being like some super sex manual, and indeed, it was written in ancient India, and what distinguishes the Kama Sutra is a clear acceptance. It is sex positivity tenfold. It accepts the idea that there are lots of things you could do in order to seek pleasure, and the point of sex was to have pleasure and give your partner pleasure. And it certainly talks about male-male couplings, female-female couplings, and some of the depictions, look like you'd have to be pretty athletic to etc. But whoever wrote it, well, you can be sure of this. We don't know who wrote it exactly, but we know they had a Y chromosome. Because even though it's very important that the female partner be pleased, that's clearly a goal there, it never mentions the clitoris. What woman would have talked about pleasing a female partner and left out the clitoris, right? Didn't happen. So it's not so super wise after all. Oh yeah, that says that. And I'm going to skip over this. Neuroscientists have tried to look at, for example, what brain regions are active during orgasm. As some of you know from other classes, I'm a total skeptic about whether functional MRI has ever actually told us anything. But guess what? fMRI says when you're having orgasm, the brain's pretty busy. Who's shocked, right? And in terms of which areas are active, I don't think there's any information to be gained from that you didn't already know. But that doesn't mean that it isn't going on. In Western culture, at least, the history of ideas about homosexuality, we can't talk about it much without contrasting these two men, Sigmund Freud and Magnus Hirschfeld. Sigmund Freud, clearly a brilliant man. At the turn of the century in 1900, he publishes a book called Interpretation of Dreams, and it takes the world by storm. Instant bestseller around the world. And in it, he talks extensively about how important sex is in people's lives. And in his view, many of the problems adults had were neuroses caused by problems in the development of their sexuality. And he didn't talk, he referred to same-sex desire as an inversion, sexual inversion. And in at least a letter, at least one letter is out there, he makes a point to a mother that no, there's nothing morally wrong with same-sex attraction or same-sex sexual activity. But nevertheless, he assured her that if she paid him enough, he could cure her son of this idea. And there's no evidence that, in fact, that was ever successfully done. Contrast with someone of the same time, Magnus Hirschfeld, was German. Freud lived in Vienna. Hirschfeld was German and happened to be gay. And he regarded homosexuality as perfectly acceptable and perfectly natural. To him, the idea that people were attracted to the same sex just represented a third sex. And so a difference between them is Freud thought sexual orientation developed as a result of development and in terms of cues that children got from their environment, especially their parents, as they were growing up. And that if you were attracted to the same sex, it was because somehow you hadn't gotten the right cues, the right information as you grew up. Hirschfeld, on the other hand, felt like people who were attracted to the same sex, that it was something within them, and that it wasn't a result of social influences at all. So we would refer to him as being an essentialist, that people being attracted to same sex wasn't common, but when it happened, it was, because they were different from the beginning. He, he didn't say it this way, but he would have agreed with Lady Gaga that people are born this way. Later, we'll see why I have some problem with that too, but that idea, because in fact, nobody's born with a sexual orientation. Babies don't have a sexual orientation, right? So, yeah. Oh, and having mentioned that Kinsey reported that 10% of the population was gay, I need to point out, I forgot to point out that Kinsey is not immune for criticism. We know that his sampling method of how to find people was flawed. This was before social sciences had gotten better at trying to come up with things like random samples of people. But we know that his sampling was not random because he was only talking to people who were willing to sit in a closed room and talk about their sexual behavior. That was one thing. And there were certain classes of people that were overrepresented, and especially in academia. And having found people in academia, he always asked people if they knew other people who might tell them might be willing for an interview. And so that too is going to get you a biased sample. So today, most guesses are in the United States, at least right now, things are changing. Maybe less than 5% of people are exclusively attracted to the same sex. So on the other hand, he was using the best scientific methods of his day. Question about any of that? Okay, must be time for a Kahoot. So get out your phones and you want me to introduce you? You want me to introduce you? Yeah. Stand up. That's Sage. No, no. Oh, you want to come up front? Definitely genetically related, right? Yes, 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 yes. And and his father's back there. I was just going to have you take a bow from back there, but that's good. So did you learn anything from this lecture, or you mostly been on the computer?
A little bit.
Excellent, perfect answer. All right, now go back. Yeah, yeah. Okay, and so I got to exit and then start it again, and that other. You let me down, Ian. What now? What do I need to do? Ah, okay. All right. So now we're going to talk about Appendix A, which is about the evolution of sex. One of the things you're going to discover that you may not know yet is that for evolutionary biologists, sexual reproduction is a bit of a mystery. There's a really kind of a strange thing that it even happens, and in some ways it kind of flies in the face of other things that we know about evolution. We're going to see that you don't have. I mean, for most of the history of life on Earth, organisms reproduced and they never bothered with sex. And for single cells, that was pretty easy. And you're going to learn about that most multicellular organisms reproduce through sex, but plenty of species use both sperm and ovus. And we'll see that there are some species out there where there are no males. Who needs them, right? And we'll talk about these things. So the first point is that the idea of sex and copulation for life on Earth, that's a new idea. So the Earth is, over 4 billion years old, and the first living things, we think, were done here with organisms that more or less everybody would sometimes steal genes from each other, or bacteria have been around a long time, and sometimes they reproduce by swapping DNA, but they can reproduce just fine without ever doing that. And so the first unicellular organisms that have a nucleus, eukaryotes, they arise about 2.5 billion years ago. And yet the first organisms that use gametes and sexually reproduce, it isn't going to happen for another billion years. And the idea of making your gamete and then one individual sticking their gametes inside the other individual, that's really new, right? That's just, barely happened. And although it does predate the first mammals. Questions about that? And it's the question about the evolution of sex is, if you think like an evolutionary biologist and you wonder, I mean, if you've heard evolutionary biologists, you maybe heard them talk about how many things individual organisms do in order to maximize their genetic contribution to the next generation, right? And those individuals, Darwin has said, because they're so well adapted to their environment, those individuals who had lots of offspring contributed lots of genes to the next gene pool. And if they were also carrying some beneficial mutations, that means populations over time would end up with more of those positive mutations. But if you're trying to maximize your genetic contribution to the next gene pool, why make organisms that only have half your genes? Why not make individuals that have all your genes? And we'll see, there are animals that can do that. So to talk about the importance of sexual evolution on this planet, sexual reproduction on this planet at least, I have to go over some things I think everybody knows, but I want to be clear. So DNA, all the inherited information you're going to get from your parents was in DNA. The DNA inside the nucleus of your father's sperm and your mother's eggs. And lots of organisms do show sex. And pardon me, I meant to say, and we're going to, for our purposes, we're going to say that a stretch of DNA that encodes for a particular protein, we're going to call that a gene. You can come up with more precise definitions, but we don't need them for this course. And it's been interesting for me watching it unfold. You don't know, but before you were born, at least, even 10 years before that, everyone's estimate was that human beings must have lots of genes, 100,000 genes. And in that time, every couple of decades, it turns out the estimates of how many genes humans have keep going down. Right now, some people think it might be as little as 10,000 genes. And there are plenty of organisms out there that have lots more genes than that, right? So lesson number one, having lots of genes doesn't mean that you're more complicated or more successful, right? Things happen. But there are, between 10 and 30,000 genes, and all these genes are arrayed in chromosomes. So the first thing about sexual reproduction is that those cells that organisms use to reproduce, we call them gametes. And as we'll see, individuals who make big gametes, we call them females. And their gametes are eggs or ova, a single being ovum. And individuals who make teeny tiny little gametes, we call those males. And we'll talk more about that. And in general, I include this just to let you know that Sperm are tiny compared to eggs. On the other hand, males make a lot more sperm than females make eggs. And as far as I know, that's true across every species that use sexual reproduction. Oh, and for terminology, once the sperm fuses with the egg, uh, that's called fertilization or conception. Oh, and I don't include it here. And this fertilized egg we call a zygote. Good, Kamika. There's definitely an interaction going on. Is that the egg is definitely making the decision about who to let in, and there's lots that's not known about that, but there's definitely a contribution there. On the other hand, it's not clear that the female totally decides, that the egg totally decides, right? As with most other things, there's competition going on, right? Because think of a situation in animals, for example, where several different males have contributed sperm to the reproductive tract, and they're all swimming upstream trying to be the one. And you can imagine how natural selection would provide an adaptive the adaptive significance of some sperm having a better chance of getting in than others. And so there is and has always been an arms race, not just at the who gets to have sex with who level, but at the which sperm gets to win the prize. And we'll talk about that a lot. The, the genes happen to be organized in humans in these chromosomes, and every human somatic cell has 23 pairs of these chromosomes, so 46 total. And you can pair them for a given cell. You can pair them, and people a long time ago gave them numbers, right? So there was the human chromosome number 1, 2, et cetera, 22, and then the sex chromosomes, X and Y. And we refer to the different versions of a particular gene that are on 2 different chromosomes within a pair. We refer to them as alleles. Same gene intended to encode for the same protein, but they're often not exactly the same recipe, right? The stretches of DNA, there may be differences between them. And so one allele may encode for a protein that's a little bit different than another allele. Sometimes the alleles differ, and yet because of redundancy in the codon scheme, the same amino acid gets used. But sometimes there's a difference and a different amino acid gets put there. And sometimes that doesn't much affect the protein function, and sometimes it has a disastrous effect on the protein function. And sometimes whole bits of a gene are missing from one chromosome or the other. In other cases, there may be a duplication of a gene, sort of stuttering that happens. So in terms of terminology, for the adult, each one of these chromosomes, each chromosome in a pair came exclusively either from mom or dad. So if it came from mom, we say it's a maternal contribution, and it came from dad, it's a paternal contribution. So in some cases, dad may have had a different version, a different allele of the gene than mom did. And that's not just common, that's universal, right? On the other hand, it could be that mom and dad had the same copy, right? But by the time you look at 10,000 genes, the odds that they both had the very same allele for all those genes is basically nil. And to understand sexual reproduction, we have to contrast cell division in the normal course of growth, which is called mitosis, versus cell division to start making gametes, which is called meiosis. And meiosis, I don't think it's used in any other context anymore, but it's just an English word that's been around for centuries that used to just mean a belittling, making something smaller. That was a process of meiosis. And you can see why it was applied here, because of these 2 daughter cells they're going to result, one of them is going to have fewer chromosomes than the other. How's that so far? And this is what happens in order to make gametes. But when an animal is growing, I guess I didn't include that. When an animal is growing, as you know, I'm not going over that in detail, Once the fertilized egg happens, it starts dividing, and in that case, every cell, every descendant will have the same set of chromosomes inside it. And each one will be, in each pair, one chromosome will come from dad and one would come from mom, right? And that's called mitosis. That sort of division where there's total replication of the DNA is mitosis. But if you're going to make gametes, you have to make cells that only have one of each of the pairs of chromosome, right? Only one chromosome number one, only one chromosome number two, et cetera. And either an X or a Y if you happen to be a male, or it'll always be an X if you're a female, but sometimes it might, well, more about that later. Questions about that? I'm going kind of fast, but. So in mitosis, this is a story you've heard lots of times before, going back to uh, high school and elementary school, where in mitosis, a cell, before it's going to divide, the first thing it has to do is replicate all of the DNA it has. So it has to make a copy of every chromosome, all 46, and each one is supposed to be a faithful reproduction. So in the S phase, which stands for synthesis, the cell will, in preparation for mitosis, and here we're only showing one pair of chromosomes just to make it easier to understand. But imagine the same thing happening with all 23 pairs of chromosomes. So first you got to duplicate it all, and then eventually each pair will get pulled apart by these mitotic spindles that 18th century biologists were able to see with their crude microscopes when cells were dividing. And so during metaphase, they get lined up and pulled apart, and then each half of the cell gets one set of chromosomes, and when it's done, you've got two cells, and they have exactly the same chromosomes and exactly the same alleles in exactly the same order, right? And you do that trillions of times, and you can make a mouse, and trillions more, and you make an elephant, right? But the basic process is the same, and that you've heard about before. Another bit of terminology is we want to call, what do you call a cell that's in G2, about to go into metaphase? What do you call the duplicated chromosome? So we'll call them chromatids. They're supposed to be faithful copies, but there's too many of them in here. And so we can separate them, talk about one chromatid or the other. And one of the chromatids is going to go to this daughter cell, and the other chromatid is going to go to that daughter cell. So far, so good? And when it's over, I mean, there are other divisions take place, but when it's over, every cell is supposed to be exactly alike. And so we say that because it's got a complete set of chromosomes, we say it's diploid. It's got two chromosomes of every type. Number one, chromosome number two, chromosome number three. It's got two, and we say it's diploid. In order to make a gamete, you have to make a cell that's haploid, that has only one copy of each of the 23 pairs of chromosomes. And so for meiosis to take place, you've got to figure out how to separate two different chromatids. The process is actually fairly complex, but we're going to simplify it here because I want to talk about the important part for the evolution of sexual behavior, sexual reproduction. So in meiosis, so mother first has a diploid cell, and it duplicates as normal, total copy of each chromosome. So now it has two chromatids for each one, and dad's doing the same thing. But, and And I want to point out that at this phase, look at mom's pair. This is one pair of chromosomes. Let's call it chromosome number one. I want to point out that in this case, this chromosome that mom got is the maternal chromosome. It's a chromosome she got from her mom. And the other chromosome is a paternal chromosome. She got that from her dad. So far, so good. And so far, they've been separate. That's the important part. What happens next, though, is when at this phase, when mom, let's say, duplicates all the chromosomes, so she's got, you know, 4 sets of chromatids there. What happens at this point is her paternal and maternal copies of the chromosome, they start switching parts, which you don't need to bother to do when you're just doing mitosis. But as we'll see, this is really important for making a gamete. So we're showing here, imagine that this end of that chromatid swap parts with that end of that chromatid. When things are going well, the swaps always take place between homologous regions of the 2 chromatids. And what we're showing here, that there's only one little swap, total simplification. Lots of swaps are going on between every chromatid pair. They are swapping genes back and forth so that she now has, this chromatid has some maternal chromosome and some paternal chromosome. Or if we looked at it more accurately, it wouldn't just be one area that swapped. One chromosome, each chromosome will have hundreds of genes from mom and hundreds of genes from dad on the same chromosome. Notice that that wasn't the case before. And this process of chromosomes swapping bits of genetic material in preparation for meiosis is known as recombination. You can see why it's called that. Because what's going to happen is each gamete that gets produced is going to have a different composition of mom's maternal and paternal alleles. Everyone get that? And in fact, there's so much recombination going on, when people have done the math, is every gamete mom makes has a unique combination of her maternal and paternal genes. That's how much is going on. That's how much of the swapping is going on. Mathematically, it's impossible for her to make the same gamete twice. Likewise for dad, even though he's making a lot more gametes than she is, it's still true that when you do the math and people looked at, how much recombination is going on, et cetera, every gamete he produces has a unique combination of genes, some of which he got from his mom and some of which he got from his dad. This process of recombination is the engine that drives evolution. What it does is it ensures every offspring is genetically unique. And that means the offspring are going to differ from one another in terms of what genes they have, which alleles they have, and those differences in the alleles might make a difference in how well, first of all, whether the fertilized egg survives, and number 2, how many offspring that particular individual will leave behind. Darwin did not say that natural selection ensures that every individual in a population is optimally constructed and is the optimum of fitness. In fact, it was quite the opposite. In fact, within every population, evolution has arranged not that everyone's going to be perfect, but that individuals vary a lot within a population. And one indication that evolution doesn't make a population perfect, doesn't make every individual perfect, what percentage of people are infertile? What's your guess? Who happens to know? There's a rough and ready figure. About 10%. They're not going to reproduce at all. In terms of fitness, in terms of contributing to the future gene pool, those individuals are going to contribute nothing. There's nothing, it's never going to happen. So clearly, not everything in a population is perfect. the point Darwin made is that within every population, there's a wide variation in how reproductively successful individuals will be. And that means that some are going to contribute, or some are going to have a lot more offspring than others. And in general, and on average, and across time, individuals with more adaptive features are going to leave more offspring behind. And that means characteristics of the population are going to change over time. And that could explain why, when you look at the fossil record, for example, species clearly change over time. People have known that for quite a while already. But he offered an explanation for how that could happen. And it wouldn't be possible except for recombination. That's how you end up mixing all the genes together. And there's some, think about that for a moment. I just told you about 10% of the population is infertile. Now, you, though, if I go back long enough, you had thousands of ancestors, right? 2 parents, 4 grandparents, 8 great-grandparents, etc., thousands of them. And you know what? Every one of them reproduced. None of them were among the 10%, because otherwise you wouldn't be here. That's natural selection and evolution at work. On the other hand, let's pretend we live in a world where women are still having 7 or 8 children per lifetime. Even in that world, what percentage of women alive at one point would still have any children left 5 generations later? There's no way you can know this. The answer is hardly any. It'd be a tiny minority of people. Of you, I mean, even for you females, but I can't. Even if reproductive rate goes up in the United States, most of us will have no offspring 5 generations from now. That too is natural selection at work. And that too is a result of recombination. You can't get those sort of numbers except for the fact that every individual is unique. We'll talk later about, monozygotic twins, but in that case, those are 2 individuals who came from the same pair of gametes. I mean, where they worked it out best was in Iceland, where there's all this genetic information about everybody. So you can ask yourself, of the people that were alive in 1750, how many have any offspring living in Iceland or anywhere else in the world today? And the answer is, I forget, like 15%. So if you were thinking, I want to have a family and I'm going to have lots of children, my children will be out there someday, odds are against you. And you might be fooled into thinking that because remember, all your ancestors, they all had someone, the ancestors you had 5 generations ago, they all succeeded, but they were a tiny fraction of the total that were alive at that point. Well, I mean, if you have no children, 10% of the people have no children. I don't know the exact numbers, but there are lots of people who have children but no grandchildren. And there are people who have grandchildren, no great-grandchildren. And there are people that have great-grandchildren but have no great-great-grand. I mean, at every point, right, there's a possibility. I mean, if at any generation they don't happen to choose to reproduce, or they don't have that chance to reproduce, then you won't have any descendants. Sorry if you were thinking about founding a dynasty and making a big contribution someday with your genes. And there, that's just saying what I just said. Questions about that? Okay. Couple of things. Number one, you won the lottery. The fact that you exist today means you won a lottery, right? It meant every one of your ancestors reproduced. Number two, you won the lottery because recombination gave you a pretty good set of genes. Otherwise, you wouldn't be here. because, well, because lots of zygotes get formed that never even make it out of the womb. And there's quite a few babies that are born that don't live to your age, right? And um, in general, most women have several miscarriages. Even if they're trying to get pregnant, most women will have several miscarriages before they even know they were pregnant. So, and yet you were carried to term and you've gotten this far, and you must have got a pretty good set of genes because here you are in college, right? That's not easy. Not easy to get here, not easy to succeed. Mm, Lots of things happen in your favor. How's that? And now here's an evolutionary bent to it. Of those 10,000 alleles that you have, each one of us is good enough, right? Every one of those alleles was at one time a mutation that had never happened before. And every one of them came from a different ancestor, right? So, in some sense, you are the combination of thousands of beneficial mutations, right, that have come together in one individual. And those mutations arose in thousands of different ancestors. Because the odds of most mutations, as we'll see, are harmful. Very few mutations provide any benefit. And the odds of one individual having two beneficial mutations is virtually nil. And the only reason you got to live and have this combination of thousands of good enough alleles is because of sexual reproduction and recombination. You should be really glad for recombination, right? It's how you got here. Questions about that? In talking about DNA, of course, we have to talk about paternity tests. And I'm going to go over this in more detail later, but I want you to think about something. So these paternity tests, they used to require quite a bit of technology. Now you can buy a paternity test kit at Walmart, right? You buy it over the mail. These paternity kits happen because it sometimes happens that there are men who suspect that their wife, gathered the sperm for their child from somebody other than themselves. Or in other cases, there's one person or the other might want to prove that's the father and not somebody else. That's why paternity tests exist. We'll talk about how they work in a moment. So, some statistics. First of all, somewhere around 10% of children that are out there were not fathered by the partner. It's rare. If you look at men who seek a paternity test because they're kind of questioning whether that kid's theirs or not, in those cases, it's much more likely to be an extra pair contribution. That is, they're much more likely that it's with somebody else with the father. But even there, it's like 30%. So the vast majority of those men who think that might not be my kid, I better check it out. Turns out they're wrong. It is their kid, right? And you might wonder why so many men think that way. And so I want you to think about that. Why do so many men worry and think that their wives are unfaithful when in fact, mostly they are? And here's the real kicker. When a man finds out that his wife had a baby and it's not his child, should he be required to pay child support for that child until they're 18? You don't get to answer because it's time for me to wrap up, but we'll talk about this next time. Okay? Thanks.